Welcome to Earth Talks. And today's speaker is going to be introduced by my colleague who helped plan the semester, Antonia.
So hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. Today, we're excited to have Professor Ben Hobbs from Johns Hopkins University. So I'll just give you a brief. He has a very long bio, but I'm going to give you the abbreviated version.
Please.
He has earned his PhD from Cornell University. He has been at Johns Hopkins since 1995 in what is now the Department of Environmental Health and Engineering, and was previously on the faculty at Case Western Reserve University and a staff researcher at Brookhaven and Oak Ridge National Labs. And today he'll be presenting on City-Heat, which is a decision-focused adaptive management framework for Baltimore. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Tony. Terrific honor to be here with my colleagues from BSEC to be talking a little bit about decisions concerning how we might prevent health impacts from heat waves in cities that are suffering from urban heat islands. And Baltimore is one of those cities. So let's see, I first have to acknowledge that a lot of people contribute to this presentation, including Antonia. She just had a terrific set of slides on decision science that I said, I can't do any better, so can I just steal yours? I hope to remember to give you credit, and I did. This is work that's been done by 2 PhD students, one graduated and another now working. You're going to be seeing a work in progress. So there's some slides that say you're not allowed to quote them, and I'm going to be asking some questions. Well, what do you make of this? What do you think we should do next? The reason it's a work in progress is that it was originally a thesis that was going to result in some nice publications and perhaps be used to get some insight in Baltimore, but instead it wound up being a core piece of the Baltimore Social Environmental Collaborative, a $20 million project headed by my colleague Ben Schaefer, which is going to be a framework for a number of us to work together to help the city decide what to do in the near future about the increasing frequency and impacts of urban heat waves in Baltimore, keeping in mind that stakeholders have a diversity of objectives and there are incredible uncertainties about what the future holds for us in terms of technology, in terms of social trends, population in the city, and of course, in terms of climate. The question is, what do we do now given that? And this provides a way for us to kind of organize all the information that you need to consider in such a process and talk about it and think about it systematically. It is not a model that gives you the answer. There is no single answer in part because what solution you prefer will depend on your priorities, what objectives you think are important, and also on what futures you think are most likely. These are both things that people can disagree about. So this relates to my second point. Why do decision analysis at all? And the major reason is that there are so many things to keep in mind that if you just sort of sit around a table and bang on it, you're sure to miss something important and make a decision that fails to accomplish everything that you want to accomplish. And it gives way for people to negotiate, to understand where we have interests in common, where we might agree, and importantly, where do we disagree and we need to think some more. I will, in the middle of the talk, give a little survey of the issue of urban heat waves and why that's so important. And then I'll talk about the method that Ray developed and Ali is now improving to frame the decision and give some information about the alternatives for dealing with heat waves that might be useful in deciding what we should do now. And then finally, I'll illustrate the use of the method with some results. I'm not going to present some hard and fast results that, plant Bartlett pears now all over the city, or paint all the streets chartreuse. There's no answer that's best in all objectives that does well no matter what happens in the future in terms of resolving uncertainties. And the ones that pop out and look good now may not look good as we work to improve this framework. As I said, city heat is a work in progress. We're trying to improve it, and I actually would appreciate your questions and comments about how we might do that. So first, a little bit about the Social Environmental Collaborative. It's one of several funded by the U.S. Department of Energy to deal with issues of climate adaptation. It's a 5-year project whose purpose is to produce science, but also to inform decisions about how to take action in the face of climate. And action can be climate change prevention, reducing emissions, and it could be climate change adaptation, where here comes higher sea levels and more severe storms and higher temperatures. How do we minimize their impacts upon the citizenry? And there's an important adjective here, equitable, that there's a strong emphasis on environmental and economic and racial justice. So there are a lot of players here. In center field, we have Penn State. In left field, we have Johns Hopkins. We have an awful lot of other folks playing shortstop and catcher and pinch hitter. Stakeholders, national labs, and it's definitely the 2 universities that I think are the main leaders on this are Penn State and Hopkins in terms of the science and the decision analysis that's going to use that science to make recommendations about adaptation. And what we're hoping to do with 4 different sets of environmental problems that arise from climate adaptation, these 4 being urban heat, urban runoff and storms, air pollution, and finally greenhouse gas reductions. Whereas we're going to engage the public and folks who work for the city of Baltimore and local governments on talking about what do we really want to accomplish in adaptation, what's really most important to deal with, and what are the constraints that limit what we can do. And then we're going to be doing science to try to better understand how the system is responding now to climate change, what's happening now, and how it might do so in the future, especially as we take some actions to mitigate its impacts. This will lead to then a discussion about, well, what do we want to do, given that we have a number of goals, we may not agree on those goals, given that there are a number of uncertainties, we may not agree on how those will be resolved. Are there strategies that make the most sense to pursue now, and maybe some other things that we should wait and see on? So there's going to be a lot of discussions about this, and City Heat is a framework for having these discussions and making recommendations. For example, well, we need some more data, or how we're thinking about equity and fairness is not clear. We need to do some more hard work on that. So there's going to be some iteration there over the 5 years, but hopefully in the end, a set of decisions, pathways we call them, that the city can take and move forward and protect its populations. Okay, so why do we do decision analysis? Antonia, thank you very much for these. Well, you don't have to blame for all these. I've modified them somewhat. So if she gasps, you know what's happened. So what's decision analysis, and why should we care? There are 3 separate types. So if you've studied philosophy and you've studied people like Kierkegaard or Aristotle. You know what a moral imperative means. There's one type of decisions are what you should do given some sort of moral standard that you and others may agree upon. I'm not going to talk about that, but that's called normative decision theory. You can call it ethics if you want. Descriptive on the bottom is what behavioral economists, psychologists do. They want to know how people actually make decisions. Why do people do such stupid things? But what we're doing is something in the middle, and I call it conditional normative decision making, or you can call it prescriptive decision making, where given what your goals are, or what the goals of a group of people are, and given the information that they have and real life constraints, what would make you happiest, or what decisions should you make in the end? And that's a lot of hard work to think about the alternatives, and also hard to work to think about what it is that you really want. When you walk into Starbucks in the morning, if there's a Starbucks State College, right? You know what you want. It's a decision you make every day. But really important decisions you don't make very often. And they can be quite difficult because you haven't thought hard about what it is you really want. And we're going to do that here. So here's some traditional steps to prescriptive decision analysis. You don't just turn the crank and do it, but the elements are here. You're defining the problem, what you're trying to accomplish. What can you do about for example, the heat wave problem? What might happen in the future? What are some things you're uncertain about? And then you do some modeling or data analysis or scratching of the head to estimate how different alternatives might perform under alternative states of the world. And then once you've written that down, you make a recommendation somehow, and it may be completely subjective, or you may do this with the help of an analytical method. So as an example, if we want to build a cooling center where people can go when the temperature hits 115, 120 degrees, or 130 degrees as it did in Death Valley a couple of years ago in California, you might say, well, where's the best place to put that where it's most accessible to the people who need it, does the most good? Your alternatives might be 3 different neighborhoods, and the uncertainties might be where are heat waves going in the future? How bad are they going to get? And how vulnerable are people to this? So what would be the mortality and morbidity response, getting sick and dying? Fourth, estimating the impacts. You might do a pretty fancy schmancy model, or you might ask some experts that, if we put it in neighborhood A and the people are vulnerable and a bad heat wave comes, how many people might pass to the other side, to put that gently. And you compare different alternatives under different scenarios. And then finally, you have some sort of decision rule where you might say, okay, in this case, there's one objective we care about, saving lives. So let's go with city A. So there's the elements. In the real world, it's much more difficult for that. And one reason it's much more difficult than that is that there's usually not one objective about saving lives, for example. There are multiple objectives that the people who live in the city of Baltimore care about justice, care about utility costs, care about convenience, care about, of course, their health, care about comfort. They care about how their city looks. So different people, they have different emphases, and that is one reason you get disagreements in difficult problems, and that people ultimately have different objectives. Preferences and values matter. This is not a somehow scientifically objective process where you turn the crank and you get the answer. Instead, you have to understand what people want. And those of you who are engineers know that engineers are part philosophers and part physicists. They have to worry about what people really want, and they also have to understand how the world looks and this works. And decision analysis is the same thing. You have to understand what people want, how they'll react to it, and how the alternatives will actually perform. So in a world of multiple objectives, this becomes more complicated. You have to work with the clients, with the stakeholders, with the managers. Throughout the process, to make sure you understand what, when they're comparing alternatives, what it is that's going to make them say, I like that one and dislike that one. And sometimes they don't know themselves. Decision analysis has a little bit of applied psychoanalysis to it, where people reflect and say, hey, every morning I get a cappuccino. That's not a hard decision, but it is a hard decision to decide, for example, where to live, where my kids should go to school, what sort of job I want to take, and then, of course, for the important things for society. So to solve these problems, after you have alternatives and objectives, what the analysis then does is tries to eliminate some alternatives that you never would choose, no matter what objectives you have, and no matter what how the uncertainties turn out. You have to communicate these trade-offs to the stakeholders, who then have to think about what they want. And once they get an idea of what they like and don't like, that can be the basis for negotiation. And so this is the process that we're going to go through in Baltimore. On top of the multiple objectives, we have to deal with uncertainties. So the trivial problems are ones where you know exactly what's going to happen in the future, but we're dealing with problems on the opposite spectrum. That deep uncertainty, for example, about how high sea levels will rise over the next 50 to 70 years. How much warmer will it get? What will happen out in the tail of the distributions of storms in terms of how much rainfall we'll get or how warm we'll get? And decision-making uncertainty is relatively simple, although we do have multiple objectives. Under risk, when we know the probability distributions, it's getting more complicated. The most complicated is when we don't have any idea what the likelihood is of losing the Greenland ice sheet and having the sea level rise 30 feet or not over the next century or two. But we can't ignore those possibilities. So the most difficult problems have multiple objectives and deep uncertainties, and that's what we're dealing here with urban heat waves. So let's talk about objectives. First, health concerns. This shows some projections by IPCC of where temperatures might go over the next few years. And as you've heard, last year we broke the 1.5 degree barrier, at least according to consensus of some scientists. So that's out here somewhere. And we may have a heat rise as much as 3 times that amount by the end of the century. And of course, it's not the average that matters so much for health as the extremes. The left graph shows annual heat deaths per million in the previous decade. So and this shows that in the South, that by state, they might be in the few dozens per million. So times 300 million in the population. A few dozen then turn out to be 1,000 or 2,000. By the 2090s, we're talking about numbers that are orders of magnitude greater. Interestingly, perhaps a lot worse, very much worse in the North than in the South, which has perhaps already partially somewhat adapted to that. I have no idea why Pennsylvania is worse than both New York and Maryland sandwiched in between. I'd be interested in your speculation on that. Now, the concern with heat deaths versus other things, you might wonder, well, we just lost 1 million people due to COVID. So what are a few thousand deaths due to heat? reason that heat gets a lot of attention, at least in terms of deaths due to extreme events. Heat is responsible for more of those than these other sources, which I have cleverly hid behind a, excuse me, though those include flooding and extreme storms and others. Sorry about that, folks. But heat is the worst of those that NOAA keeps track of and is concerned about. Other reasons why it's important is that a lot of the worst heat impacts are in precisely those locations and cities where we've had historical environmental injustices, social injustices such as redlining policies in Baltimore. And we have urban heat islands that are getting worse, so we're going to see greater impacts in the cities themselves, perhaps among populations that are most vulnerable, least able to protect themselves. And finally, as the climate change gets worse, we're going to see many more events in the tails, which are precisely those that cause the biggest impacts. Okay, so let's talk about the decision analysis methodology. This is just one approach you might take to considering the many objectives and the deep uncertainties that face us in order to make recommendations about what Baltimore should do today in the face of these risks and impacts. Ray's thesis was undertaken as part of the Marissa Center, which I'm proud to say is something that Penn State and Hopkins and the RAND Corporation, among others, have been and are still running. Some of you know Rob Nicholas, who's been very much a participant in this. And so under that, Ray developed his thesis. We decided that urban heat was a climate adaptation problem that perhaps exceeded all others for Baltimore in importance. So he decided to do a thesis on that. And interesting what's happening. I'm not getting all of my graphics on the slides. I apologize for that. This was going to be a map of Baltimore and 10 districts that he considered in his modeling. You'll see some results that have been published that are from his simple model. And there are all sorts of issues about those because there are a lot of issues that we treated very simply in order to get some initial results to show what you can learn from this. You will also see some results that Ali, the PhD student that's following on in Ray's footsteps in the BSEC project, some runs that Ali has put together from a more sophisticated version of this that we're hoping will be more useful for decision making for reasons that I'll explain. We chose back in Marissa the heat problem because it's basically there are big resources that could be devoted to trying to mitigate it. Hundreds of millions of dollars or even more than $1 billion in Baltimore. They could really improve the quality of life for Baltimore residents, not just in terms of reducing heat-caused mortality, morbidity, but improving quality of life. But there are also big risks of failure because there are a lot of uncertainties. For example, if you paint the streets white, how long will that be effective? If you plant trees, how big of an impact will that have on temperatures in the city? And will the trees survive? I've mentioned Bartlett pears. We have a lot of streets without trees in Baltimore because the Bartlett pears drop their branches and have a hard time surviving in an urban environment. We didn't know that when we planted that 20 to 30 years ago. We have similar uncertainties today. We could invest a lot of money in something that doesn't do very much good. And so we need to consider the risks and we need to consider the multiple objectives. Okay, there are four major components to a decision analysis. I'll mention each of those in this context. You worry about uncertainties. We'll call those X. These uncertainties include not just what's going to happen in the physical climate, how much warmer is it going to get, how quickly, what's going to happen, and especially the tails of the events. How extreme will things get? What's going to happen to the demographics and the housing stock in the city? If there are many fewer people in the city, but they're particularly vulnerable, that's a different situation than if the city starts growing again and becomes more prosperous. And then finally, I mentioned the effectiveness of street painting and green roofs and tree planting. How much does that help to cool the city, and how much will it wind up costing? And what other benefits might we get from these actions? For example, will people's heating and cooling bills go down as a result of planting trees? Some people have argued that crime rates are decreased by planting trees. And is that something that could actually happen or not? The second component we worry about are the levers, or the things that we can do, the joysticks we can grab and move around. What sort of actions can you take? For example, painting the streets, or planting trees, or green roofs, or cooling centers. And then where should you put them? Which neighborhoods? What year should you implement? Should you wait and see what's going to happen and how effective things are? Or should you invest a lot right away so you get the benefits sooner? If you don't start planting trees now, it's going to be that much longer before you get the benefits of that. And then how much should you do of each of these options? Should you spread them thinly over the city, or concentrate them in areas where maybe the most vulnerable populations are? Let's see, the third component are models. You have to have some way of relating the alternatives to the objectives that you have, and to understanding how the alternatives will perform under different uncertainties. And those are the models. So you go from the levers, you get the external uncertainties and how they act, and then that determines the outcomes, which are measured by metrics or measures. And there are many of these. Health is one, not necessarily the most important, but certainly important one. Cost, fairness, other benefits that people might get from these actions, or disbenefits. You may not like the glare on the streets. If you paint the streets white, it may cool the neighborhood, but at the same time might hurt your eyes and make being outside less pleasant rather than more pleasant. The goal of City Heat is to integrate these four components and provide insights to help folks improve decisions. Improve decisions by helping people to understand what's at stake, what the trade-offs are, what you get for spending money in terms of improvements to the other objectives. And you also improve decisions by helping people think through what it is that they really want. So if you look at a picture of a city street with trees, would you look at that and say, okay, is that what I want? Do I like how that also improves the look of the neighborhood? Or would I rather treat twice as many or 5 times as many streets through street painting and have a bigger impact on temperatures, but it doesn't look quite as attractive? What's more important? Mitigating temperature increases or improving the look of fewer neighborhoods in the city? Because with the same amount of money, you can't do them both, and you can't do them both to the same extent. That's a hard question. I don't think I could answer that right away if you asked me. And I'm sure that most of the other people in this room wouldn't be able to answer that. Decision analysis can help you think about that, imagining what it might look like, what it would be like to live in that, and thinking about what it is that you really want. is a degree of temperature really significant compared to what it might mean for the quality of life? Those sorts of questions. Interesting what it's doing to my graphics. I apologize for this. Okay, on the left were various data sources that get fed into this model to then help us model the uncertainties, model the impacts of levers upon the measures. And here I just list them a little bit more comprehensively. In the first version of City-Heat, we had five objectives: maximize effectiveness in lowering heat-based mortality. Okay, nothing about morbidity. We're missing that. Nothing about sickness, asthma cases, just deaths. So that's perhaps a little crabbed. Minimize cost. Well, that's overly simplistic because there are different colors of money. There's money that comes out of the city budget. There's money that comes out of homeowners' pockets to maintain their landscaping. There's federal dollars that could help the city of Baltimore. They would be all looked at differently. A cost to, you can't just simply add up dollars. Minimize unfairness, however you define that. Would an unfair solution be one that concentrates mostly investment in one part of the city? Or maybe that would be more fair because it's concentrated in a place where people have historically suffered injustices. What do we mean by fairness and inequity? And that's something in particular we need to think hard about. Minimize vulnerability, maximize co-benefits such as the aesthetic co-benefits or lowering greenhouse gas emissions. In a real problem, the number of objectives will be a dozen or more rather than just 5. But here I'm illustrating what you can do with the methodology. The levers, as I mentioned, cool pavements, green roofs, urban tree planting, cooling centers, and you can decide where to put them and when to build them over a 20-year planning horizon. And the modeling, we're going to model investments as being justified if you have a really bad, in recent years, you've had some really bad heat waves. That is, that will spur action. That is a hint that you really should do something. On the other hand, if you're not experiencing heat waves, maybe the local climate isn't getting that much warmer that quickly, and you should be spending the money on other things that society needs. And I'll explain why we model the decision-making in that way in a couple minutes. Uncertainties, we basically have 1,500 to 6,000 scenarios, depending on which runs you look at. These are different combinations of what happens with the future climate, what we mean by a heat wave. What is it that makes people miserable and kills people? Is it several nights in a row of temperatures that don't go below a certain level? Or is it some extreme peakiness during the day? What's going to happen to the future populations in Baltimore, their growth, their composition, their health vulnerability? And then how effective these things are. Are we going to have a Bartlett pear nightmare where the trees just die relatively quickly and drop their limbs and people don't like them? Or will tree painting, will the trees just, excuse me, not tree painting, but street painting, will the streets just turn dirty again within a year and we've wasted our money? And then finally, we do the modeling. We have epidemiologists who were on the team who helped us translate heat to mortality. These are, of course, highly uncertain. We should probably test different relationships. There's uncertainties on the geoscience side. If we increase the, if we decrease the albedo of a particular neighborhood by planting trees, excuse me, or increase the albedo, the reflectivity, by painting the streets, what happens to the temperatures? We have some notion of that, but we need more data. But to make decisions now, we need to make some calculations and make some estimates and account for the uncertainty. And then finally, we need relationships between your actions that you take and the costs. And that turns out to be a fairly simple model of 35 equations. It will soon get more complicated. Okay, so let's see how we put these pieces together. How do we do multi-objective optimization? It's interesting what this computer is doing to my slides. I apologize for this. What should be here is a trade-off. This is why God gave us chalk. So if we're trying to minimize mortality and cost, there might be all sorts of alternatives. You would like to be in the Southwest and have values as low as possible. These are called Pareto-efficient alternatives. So one thing you do in multi-objective analysis is identify those alternatives that are efficient. And by the way, I don't know, I'm just going to take a moment to acknowledge the passing of Jerry Cohen, who was president of Carnegie Mellon for 20 years, who wrote a definitive book on multi-objective programming in 1976. An incredibly well-written book, incredibly influential. And then this is a person who did miracles for Carnegie Mellon and for Pittsburgh. And maybe that will elicit some boos and hisses here, I don't know. But they're not football rivals of yours. So. But he was a mentor of mine and previously professor at Johns Hopkins. And if you want a great book on multi-objective programming, read his. So we want to find alternatives that have different advantages. This is a very costly one, which has really lowered mortality a lot. And these are ones that maybe have lowered mortality somewhat, but at a much smaller cost. And then you will discuss these during your negotiations. We have to define scenarios. And then the question is, how do we generate an alternative for which we can then calculate the impact of mortality and costs under different scenarios? And we use a method called policy-based or rule-based decision-making, in which, as you observe what happens over time to temperatures or other states of the system, you respond. And if you have some bad heat waves, you might wind up investing a lot quickly, for example, in cooling centers. Or if you see a slow, steady climb, you might instead invest more in a long-range strategy, such as tree planting. And a strategy here is a curve that translates what you observe into the actions that you take. This is different than the sort of optimization that I usually do, in which I have a set of decision variables for each year and each location and each scenario, which can result in, I have solved problems with 100 million variables. For homework problems, I only assign ones with 10 million variables. But those are very difficult to deal with. And so instead, what Ray decided to do is use a method pioneered here by a fellow who has not died. Sorry, Pat, you might not think that's funny. Pat is now a professor at Cornell, but was a professor here, and some of you may have known Pat. And of course, somebody who's Antonio has worked with. At any rate, he has developed a methodology for trying to come up with efficient strategies in a situation where the dimensionality is huge. You're worrying about thousands of scenarios and many different things that you can do. And it has proven effective in a lot of contexts. What it does is it basically combines rules for deciding when you do something applying those rules in each of maybe thousands of scenarios as the climate develops or whatever, and calculating using models the how a particular policy does under each scenario under each of the objectives. And here we happen to have 5 objectives. And then what you do is you look for, you manipulate these rules when you do something and how much you do it in order to try to find alternatives that are further to the southwest. And he has a method called Borg, and I don't even know what Borg stands for. Yes, I know what it is. The resistance is futile. I remember the Borg. Nobody laughs at that, but anymore because it's too old. But it must stand for something.
That's not just the name.
That is so nerdy. What could be nerdier than naming it after something from Star Trek that doesn't even mean anything?
The cluster at Cornell is called the cube too.
Okay. All right. So, and all right. So I'm not going to. Let's see. So I'm going to point out here that that it's an adaptive framework where over time we observe things like, oh, well, street painting really didn't work at all, so we better do something else. The rules tell you what you do. Or it's getting hotter a lot quicker than we thought, so we need to do things we can implement quickly, such as cooling centers. And this process is repeated year after year for each of the 6,000 scenarios. Here are an example of scenarios. I believe this is 150 time traces of temperature, a little bit smooth, over 50 years, that the strategies were optimized over. And then, of course, you want to do out-of-sample robustness testing to see if you've really got something. If you identify, for example, an alternative here that looks like a great compromise, does it also do well in out-of-sample scenarios? So this is a lot of work. Great subject for a dissertation. An example set of policies. So here shows one set of policies that the Borg might generate. And let me interpret a couple of these. For example, see this green line here? That shows that if you experience more than, say, 20 heat wave days over a 5-year period, in the green region, which is northeast Baltimore, you want to implement as much cool pavement as possible. The models indicate that that will make a big difference to vulnerable populations that live there. Whereas the black area downtown, not many people live there, and it wouldn't do much good. So it would take a lot of heat waves to justify doing something there. Similarly with cool roofs, there you're going to act first, it looks like in the southeast, perhaps because it has an inventory of buildings that are more suited for cool roofs. And for planting trees, the northeast, what's purple, and the southwest are places where there's a lot of places you could put trees and it could make a big difference. And you want to do that essentially right away. Okay, it's an example of a policy. Here's an example of what happens when you implement this policy for one particular scenario. You stick a bunch of cooling centers in different regions, and the tree canopy increases in force neighborhoods where you have real vulnerable populations, whereas the populations in these neighborhoods are less vulnerable, they're healthier, they're younger. The most cool pavement is in the blue area, which is the south. And the most cool roofs are in the brown area, which is the southeast. This shows the cumulative amount over time. This shows how much money you've spent in the different neighborhoods. People concerned with equity might say, how come you're not spending anything in our neighborhood? And then finally, overall outcomes. How many lives have been saved over the time period? How much money have you spent? $1.5 billion. An equity index is, for example, the difference in heat mortality rates in different neighborhoods, or some neighborhoods having a lot more problems than others. The bigger that gap is, the less fair it is. Okay, so this shows the impact of scenarios. This is a high rate of climate change scenario, and what this shows is two different time traces of deaths over time over 20 years. If you don't do anything, these are the heat-related deaths you get in different years. Obviously, this is a high temperature year. And what we see that under this plan, which involves planting a lot of trees, the green dollars are a lot of trees planted in 2020, 2024, 2029, less spent on some of these other things. You see you reduce heat rate-based mortality by about a third. That's in a high temperature scenario. This is a low temperature scenario. Hardly anybody is dying from a heat-based mortality. And the trees help you, but you're not talking about differences of dozens of people dying. In this scenario, where there's not much climate change, it's not making much of a difference. Now, you and I may disagree on which of these scenarios is most likely. If you think the upper one is more likely, you're going to be more willing to spend money to save lives than if you think the lower one is more likely, that we're not going to get extreme climate change, or at least thicker tails in Baltimore. I would like to skip to this next to last slide and the last slide. Here's another sample solution from a new version of the model that has distinctly different results, because we now have, instead of 10 districts, we now have 40 neighborhoods. And what we see is what the model suggests doing is spending some on cool pavements, which is pretty cheap, and you just keep spending evenly over time. Invest a lot in cool roofs right away, and especially, I got this right, yeah, these are the trees. Invest a lot in trees right away, and then less over time. That this seems to be a trajectory that performs well. Sorry, you can't see those figures. I don't know what happened to them. It performs well in terms of mortality reductions, reducing deaths by about 1,000 at the cost of about $1 billion. So that is $1 billion. So that's a cost of about $1 million per life saved, which sounds like a lot, but is a lot less than what the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency suggests that a human life might be worth. Wow. Okay, so I will conclude then by suggesting that this tool, City-Heat, is the first one that simultaneously considers multiple neighborhoods within the subcity, full range of heat adaptation actions, including cooling. You could give away air conditioners, multiple objectives, and finally, adaptation under uncertainty. It is now being considered for use in Seattle and in the San Francisco area, as well as in Baltimore. One advantage of this is that I haven't shown the results, but it turns out that using this Borg strategy to identify multiple strategies that do well under widely different futures gives us much better strategies than a strategy that is developed, say, under certainty. When we develop a strategy under certainty under one scenario, we wind up being not robust. We wind up being performing rather poorly under futures we didn't consider. And so the result of using the Borg is a definite improvement, lowering lives lost and lowering costs relative to simple strategies. I've talked about some of the insights, and really important here is understanding why you're getting the results you're getting. So for example, trees planting is giving you a fairer outcome in terms of lowering deaths throughout the city. And that seems to be that urban afforestation is having more widespread temperature effects than other things you might do, such as painting streets. Now, whether that's true or not, this is something Ken and I were talking about this morning. It might something that we need to verify with better modeling. So the mesoscale modeling that you're telling me about of temperature impacts of different actions and how they are diffused across the city or felt mainly locally. So next, we've got a lot more work to do in the details of this. We don't do any modeling of sickness, for example. We need to determine the best granularity. Ali is going to the neighborhood level. Is that justified by our modeling of the effectiveness of the actions? Or maybe we're really distorting the temperature effects, and getting more fine-scaled may make the distortions even worse. Or on the other hand, being more fine-scaled means that members of city council can look and see what's being recommended for their neighborhood and understand why, okay, what is it that's making my neighborhood particularly vulnerable and an attractive place to do something? So more granularity may be useful for planning, or it may simply be distorting things further. We have to work with the stakeholders to understand what they want, which objectives are their priorities, in order to really understand how they can be helped by this. So the first version of this was a thesis. The present version that we're all working on is something that will be hopefully putting on the desks in the hands of stakeholders and city managers so they can play and explore these different strategies to better understand what makes this one work so well. What do we have to do to get this additional reduction in mortality? Why is that costing so much? Or what if we do a different strategy that I suggest? Maybe it'll be down here, or maybe it'll be up there. We want to get people playing with this system for insights. This general approach, multi-objective decision-making under risk, is also going to be applied by the BSEC team to other problems. Antonia is getting underway on applying that to the problem of urban runoff and flooding and the subsequent water quality problems that we have because of increased runoff due to climate change. Also be looking at air pollution and greenhouse gas reduction. So there are a lot of fun things to do, and thank you very much.
Thanks, Ben. Questions? I'm going to hit escape so I can also see the chat in case anyone pops a question in the chat. I don't see any there right now. Questions?
Hi, thanks. I'm thinking about the space of strategies that you looked at, and I understood them to be the difference between them is sort of changing the responsiveness to heat wave frequency on each area and with respect to each adaptation action. That makes it sound like you made a decision to restrict the strategies to only look at things that are purely reactive and to not consider strategies that might take advantage of scientific insights about where the temperature and climate are going. Am I wrong about that?
So so thank you for the question. And let me see if I understand what you're asking. So insights on where the climate and the environment might be going. So are we talking about possible trajectories of future temperatures or other climatic variables or tails of distributions?
For example, projections about heat wave frequency rather than just observed frequencies.
Okay. So, is this possibly what you're asking about? Is that the policy simulation process is taking a rule and is being reactive to what is observed in the last 5 years?
Yes.
I think that's what you're talking about. So in fact, you could do something more sophisticated in which you might be developing forecasts in part based on what you've observed, but also based on what's been going on elsewhere or what's been happening with the science. So I did a study a couple decades back about controlling the levels of the Great Lakes, and based on not only what you've observed the lake levels to be doing, or which have been dropping recently, but also based on changes in where people thought future precipitation may go. As you probably know, there's a great range in forecasts about the amount and timing of precipitation under different scenarios, and this has a huge impact on lake levels. The lake levels of the Great Lakes may go up, they may go down, and so what we did is that we optimize not based on a backwards looking thing. So here we are in 2024, we might look at the last 5 years of heat waves and say, well, it's been hot, so let's do something, which might be a realistic characterization of what policymakers might do, but it might not be optimal. You may also be getting information from elsewhere. And so if you have a high, you might have a high forecast where this is based on what you've observed, but also what's going on elsewhere. You may think that this is going on, and that could be the spur to action to do something, and not just what you look backwards. So, Antonia, would you like to say anything about versions of this type of optimization, which might base actions on forecast as well as looking backwards?
Yeah, so the idea is that they're adaptive. So you're not like prescribing action at any point in time. The idea is that you're mapping a state with an action. So the idea is like, I don't know when heat waves are going to change or if they're going to change, but if they change in this way, you should be doing this. And then what City-Heat was doing was also testing them under a range of uncertainties, right? Too.
Mm-hmm.
So it was optimizing based on some expectation and then also testing how robust they were if you were wrong. So these are extra robust strategies. I don't know if that was your original question.
Not exactly, but I think we can move on.
Okay. So, yeah, in summary, the rule was based on looking backwards, but you could base on forecast, but you have to have a way of generating forecasts within the model, or imagining that, oh, this is a year where we got suddenly a high forecast, even though it's been cool the last 5 years. And that's another complication of modeling, whether it would make a difference or not.
Were you talking about seeing where heat waves are going to change and targeting there? Is that what you're talking about? I think that wasn't but the information it's considered, right? Where heat waves are changing in different districts.
Yeah, I think we're basically assuming shifts in regional temperatures
Altogether.
So altogether, but that's another uncertainty too in terms of the magnitude, the urban heat island. That's an uncertainty in the future as well. But the only climate uncertainty I think is had on the overall level. But that would be a really interesting thing to look at.
Other questions? Sam.
This is Sam, one of the graduate students I had the pleasure of having lunch with today. Thank
Hi.
you for your question.
Oh yeah, thank you for the great talk. You mentioned how you're dealing with these deep uncertainties, and I'm curious like what variables or processes are responsible for the largest amount of uncertainty in this model?
So that's a really good question. There are two ways in which uncertainty matters. So you could do a sensitivity analysis and just say, as we change the input, say the number of degrees average change, so we change the input, how does the output of the model change? Is it, the number of deaths, is it sensitive to heat, or is it more sensitive to what we assume about the demographics? Or is it more sensitive to what we assume about the effectiveness of trees? So output, sensitivity, input. The other thing that is actually more important from a decision point of view is whether the uncertainty, considering the uncertainty, changes the decision that you make. And if you ignored that uncertainty, would you really regret that? Would you really make a poorer decision that somehow leaves you, I know I've put a lot of dots here, but if you ignore that uncertainty, would you wind up choosing something that's clearly inferior, is giving you more deaths and more costs than you needed? That may not be the uncertainty that affects the output the most, but is most decision relevant. So those are two different metrics, and those are very important questions. I'm sure Ray could answer the question as to, in this case, which uncertainties made the biggest difference. If he answered that in his thesis, I don't remember what the answer was, but it is a terrific question that we should address. Clearly, those are the ones we should spend more attention on. We shouldn't be straining at gnats and doing a lot of work on something that won't affect decisions and doesn't really affect the output. Do you agree? My fellow decision expert. Okay. Thank you, Sam.
I just note that knowing which ones are the gnats is part of our problem. We're not sure which ones are the most important. Other questions? Oh my, okay. Got a few.
Thank you for your talk. I just wanted to ask something because it was just a little unclear for me in terms of scale. Is this something that is applied for cities around the US or just in Baltimore, or is it something that's supposed to be applied globally?
The scale, the domain for this particular application was the city of Baltimore, 10 districts, 40 neighborhoods. You could expand that at the expense of more computation to the entire state. 30% of heat-related deaths in Maryland are in the city of Baltimore, even though it only has 10% of the population. So it made sense to focus there first in our effort. But at the expense of having more graduate students chase after more data and running this for longer, you could look at a larger domain in a single application. But you could also have multiple teams, which is what's happening now in Seattle and San Francisco, using the software is available in GitHub. You can apply it, you could just download it and apply it. They're trying to apply it and give it test runs for their cities to see if it gives useful insights about how the West Coast should deal with this. So the spatial scope in that sense, this is not limited to Baltimore. This could apply to, but obviously the parameterizations and the scenarios and the physical structure of the city will be different, and the response may be very different as well. Thank you for your question.
This is a general question. Because you made that diagram on the board and kept going back to it, I'm realizing it makes it look like the problem is two-dimensional. It's just cost versus mortality.
Oh my gosh.
But in the beginning of your talk, you really emphasized how many different objectives and also how many different people could value those differently. So can you just, before we leave with this picture that's very two-dimensional, can you just bring us back to, how does the community make the decision and how do you bring in all those different objectives somehow?
So that's a great point. So let me show you this spaghetti diagram. So if you want to show things in more dimensions, this thing which is sometimes called the value path is a way you can do it. Now, maybe with the help of some incense and a glass wine, you can think about this and put your arms around it. But each strand of spaghetti is a different strategy and performs differently on the objective. So there are ways to visualize more, but it definitely is more difficult than in 2 dimensions. Simply identifying which ones are efficient in 5 dimensions would be an effort here. But for example, here's a very costly strategy which did pretty well on lowering mortality, but not fantastically. Sort of mediocre on the equity index, and worst case, and then this did very well in the CO2. I don't know if that's an efficient one or not. Okay, but how do I think the question you asked me, the question is, how does a set of stakeholders get their arms around this and talk about this meaningfully? So one is dimension reduction. As I said, you probably have a dozen more objectives, but they may be, some of them may be very highly correlated. So for example, spending money and mortality reduction are very negatively correlated. Mortality reductions and worst case mortality are almost perfectly reduced. Now, I'm not going to do a principal components analysis with a bunch of stakeholders and try to interpret the components, but philosophically, you could try to go in that direction and say, what's really going on here? You can spend money to lower deaths and lower the worst deaths, but a third consideration is that lowering the deaths a lot may not be a fair outcome in terms of what you've done between districts. That's what this is saying here. And then CO2, I think that's probably pretty positively correlated to what you're spending. So there are really sort of 3 dimensions here. And then you have a discussion about what's more important. And this is where, one person we talked to looked at this and said, how many people did you have die in Baltimore City during COVID? This is 1,000 people over 20 years. In COVID, we had what? We lost 1 million people out of 300 million, 1 for every 300. That is 2,000 people in over the COVID epidemic, not over 20 years. So maybe these deaths aren't really important. That's the sort of discussion that you can then get into about how does this compare to other risks that society faces and the money that the city could spend to lower other deaths. And that can be a productive discussion. There's no formula. Some people will try to elicit a utility function for people around the table, quantitative weights. I do that just simply to suggest some interesting solutions, but I would never do that to make a decision, make a recommendation. And Tonia?
Tell them a little bit about the community.
Oh, so we're trying to figure out exactly how to do that. And I think this is precisely the question that we're wrestling with this morning. How do we get people to really understand what these things mean? So one possibility, for example, if we're talking about co-benefits, is to, as landscape architects will do, come up with pictures of what a neighborhood would look like under different versions of this, and accompany that with information about what does this do to your utility bill, and the number of people who are getting ill. Very concrete and visual ways of communicating what maybe as scientists we're used to, but I would not show this to a member of the public and expect to get a meaningful response. And I think that would lead to, I think, helpful discussions. But those sorts of things can also be very biasing in that they'll bias people for things that are visually appealing, whereas the more abstract things that are happening may get less weight than they deserve. Antonio, do you have any other suggestions of what we might say about the social aspect?
Another question we are kind of struggling with is, are these even the right metrics? So if you talk with a community member and you talk to them about heat, would they mention these 5? And they probably will mention other ones. So if you were to include, say, another criterion, would you probably find different solutions, and how do you weigh them? So are we measuring the right things? It's not just about measuring them right, but are they also the right things? Are they getting to the core of the problem for the community? And different stakeholders will have different things that they care about. So there is all these dimensions to the problem. So there is like the science of like, are we doing it right? Where is heat changing? But also the community engagement part, which is who's there? How are we engaging them? Are we showing them this? And like, how do we elicit the right information from both sides? That's the struggle of the decision science team.
So this week, Antonio, you're going to be taking a few hours to digest the public input we've gotten so far, which has been more a present and react type format rather than discussions. But as an example of one thing that we learned in the last discussion is that people really don't want something that they will have to maintain and be responsible for. So if you plant trees, you better budget city money to maintain them, rather than tell the neighborhood, okay, good luck. These are your responsibility. That people really didn't like that. They came back to that more than once, which I didn't expect. And I would have thought, well, if a neighborhood's going to get trees, they're the beneficiary. Shouldn't they have some skin in the game? But
Thank Ben again. Thank you very much for coming,
thanks
Ben.
so much for inviting me.
Appreciate it, everybody. See